There's big news in the US. Joe Biden has struck a debt deal. He should finally be able to raise the debt ceiling, meaning no default, no doomsday for the global economy. The deal was struck over the weekend by Joe Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. The full document was released on Sunday. Now comes the big task, convincing lawmakers to pass the bill. Biden has called the deal a compromise. McCarthy has called it worthy of the American people. Both sides have made some concessions. The key is to convince hardliners in both parties that those concessions were necessary.
We've just spoke with Speaker McCarthy, and we've reached a bipartisan budget agreement that we're ready to move to the full Congress. And I think it's a really important step forward. And this is a deal that's good news, I believe you'll see, for the American people. The agreement prevents the worst possible crisis, a default, for the first time in our nation's history.
I'm not sure who you're talking to because we did a conference call with our conference and over 95% were overwhelmingly excited about what they see. They're getting the text today in the process.
So what's in this all-important deal? The most important part is the debt ceiling itself. It has suspended until January 2025, which means the US government can borrow again. That deadline is also important for Biden. He faces re-election in November 2024. So he won't have to negotiate another debt ceiling, at least not in this term. Let me quickly run you through the rest. Non-military spending for 2024 will be the same as 2023, meaning a cap on spending. But in 2025, it can be increased by 1%. That will make the Republicans happy. At the same time, spending on military and veterans will increase. That's something Biden pushed for. He's also agreed to slash spending on tax collection. Biden had set aside $80 billion to hunt tax evaders. That's been reduced by $10 billion. Most Social Security and Medicare schemes have been retained. But there are new work requirements for government aid. Like I said, both sides have compromised. But it doesn't matter what we think. What matters is whether hardline Republicans and Democrats will support it. Especially Republicans. They hold a wafer-thin majority in the US House. Plus, Kevin McCarthy is not in absolute control. He himself was elected Speaker on the 15th ballot. So the question is, can McCarthy get the bill passed? If he can't, all this will be for nothing. We'll be back to square one. So right now, that's the biggest worry for Biden, getting this deal passed in the House and Senate. The stock markets have rebounded after news of the deal trickled in. Oil prices have also recovered. So the short-term impact has been good. But what about the long term? How will this deal affect the US economy? Many experts are worried about the spending cap. Expenditure for 2024 has been capped at the 2023 levels. That could hurt American recovery. Bloomberg says there is a 65% risk of recession in the US. To avoid that, spending must increase. It's Economics 101. If you want to reverse an economic downturn, you must spend more. This deal prevents that. Spending will not increase next year. And the year after, it will increase by just 1%. Problem number 2 is liquidity. Once the deal is passed, the US Treasury will hit overdrive. It will have to raise a lot of money in very little time. How do they do that? By issuing bonds to the private sector. It's normal business for the Treasury, but this time the scale is massive. If the Treasury usually issues 10 bonds in one day, it will now have to issue 20. This could suck liquidity out of the system, reduce the amount on money held by the private sector. And what happens when liquidity disappears? Again, slow down. Bank of America says the impact will be equivalent to a 25 basis point interest hike. That's not good news for the US economy, especially not right now. All these challenges tell us one thing. The US debt ceiling is dangerous. Maybe it promotes bipartisanship and accountability, but only if the leaders are mature enough. In modern-day America, that doesn't seem to be the case. Leaders have repeatedly weaponized the debt ceiling, used it to politically blackmail the sitting president. So maybe that should be the biggest takeaway from this crisis, the irrelevance for the debt ceiling. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is set to visit the US next month. There's a lot on the agenda, from trade to security to Ukraine. But ahead of the visit, a US House panel has made an interesting pitch. It says India should join the NATO Plus arrangement. I know you must have a lot of questions, like what is this House panel? What is NATO Plus? And should India join it? Let's start with the first question. The proposal was made by the House Select Committee on the strategic competition between the US and the Chinese Communist Party. Yes, it's a mouthful, but it's more commonly called the China Committee. And what has this committee said? Let me quote. Including India in NATO Plus security arrangements would build upon the US and India's close partnership to strengthen global security and deter the aggression of the CCP across the Indo-Pacific region. So that answers the first question. Secondly, what is NATO Plus? Think of it as NATO's extended family. Right now, there are 5 NATO Plus members: Australia, New Zealand, Israel, Japan, and South Korea. What's common about them? They are not Atlantic countries, which is why they are part of NATO Plus and not NATO. You may ask, what's the difference? For starters, no mutual defense. NATO members are bound by Article 5. This article says an attack on one member is an attack on all. It's called collective security. NATO Plus members do not get this shield. What they do get is this: more intelligence sharing, more weaponry, and more military cooperation. Now to the final question: what should India do about this pitch? Well, right now, it's a recommendation. Such an offer has not been made by the US government. Neither has New Delhi expressed interest in it. But recently, there have been exchanges. In 2019, India held its first meeting with NATO. It was more political than military, sort of like getting to know each other. Then in March 2023, there was another meeting. America's NATO envoy said the door was opening for more engagement with India. But again, NATO Plus wasn't mentioned. So how should New Delhi see this recommendation? With a lot of doubts. Politically, the recommendation shows India's importance to the West, how it sees India as a rising power, but there is a downside. The panel also sees India as a means to an end, that end being China. Let's face it, that's a dangerous place to be because NATO is famous for using and throwing allies. And that's just one part of the problem. India's foreign policy is built on strategic autonomy, meaning New Delhi is close to everyone, to the US, to Europe, to Russia. But joining NATO Plus would limit that autonomy. It would push India closer to the West. Chances are that will hamper relations with Russia. You see, neutrality is very delicate. And right now, India is in the perfect place. It is a member of the Quad, but it is also a member of the SCO. It is invited to the G7 summit, yet it is also part of BRICS. Joining NATO Plus would tip that balance. Another issue is the level of commitment and cooperation required. Just look at the other NATO Plus members. Australia and New Zealand fought 2 world wars with America. That's how old the partnership is. Japan and South Korea are part of America's nuclear umbrella, and the US-Israel relationship doesn't need an introduction. The US is Israel's biggest political and military partner. See the problem? India's relationship with the US is very different. It is not based on shared history or treaties or culture. It is based on strategic considerations. And what is New Delhi's strategic consideration right now? To create a multipolar world, to build closer relationships with Russia and the West. NATO doesn't permit that. Neither does NATO Plus. It's an alliance rooted in the Cold War era of binaries. You are either with us or against us. Such an attitude doesn't serve India's foreign policy. Does that mean India should cut off all engagements? Absolutely not. NATO is the most powerful alliance in human history. Engaging with it is common sense. But joining it? That's the red line India shouldn't cross. There are ways to deepen engagement without joining NATO Plus, like the Quad or simply bilateral cooperation. That gives India more wiggle room in foreign policy. Now let's talk about Turkey. The results are in. The Turkish people have spoken. It's 5 more years of Recep Tayyip Erdogan as president. These elections are the biggest threat to his power. He was taken all the way by his challenger, Kemal Kilicdaroglu. It came down to a second round runoff, but eventually Erdogan triumphed. Despite his botched handling of the economy, despite his slow reaction to the earthquakes in February, the Turkish people have overlooked all his failings and given Erdogan another chance. How free and fair were the elections? The opposition claims they were not. Kilicdaroglu says they were the most unfair in years, but he hasn't disputed the outcome. So Erdogan has won his 11th election in a row, his last election apparently. Here's our report.
This was the Turkish capital Ankara last night. Thousands gathered to congratulate their leader. Recep Tayyip Erdogan has won again. He will remain Turkey's president till 2028. With this victory, he enters his third decade in power.
We are very happy, full of joy. I can't even contain myself. I thank God.
Today is our happy day. Our president has won. I feel like I'm going on a pilgrimage to Mecca.
The victory is ours. We are very happy. Bye, Mr. Kemal. Thank God, Islam has won.
She says Islam has won. That's because of Erdogan's politics. Erdogan is unabashedly a nationalist and centers his politics around religion. He has a strongman image to boot. This persona and his longevity were always going to help him, despite the disasters that Turkey is going through. Economically, Turkey is in big trouble. The lira fell to a record low against the US dollar today. It's trading at 20.10 to the dollar. It's a reflection of Erdogan's economic mismanagement. He's overseen the lira's value fall by 90% over the last decade. His unorthodox economic policies have been blamed for the lira's crash and record inflation in the country. Erdogan has also overseen a sharp turn to political Islam while in power, away from the secular politics Turkey had embraced when it became a republic in 1923. Erdogan has also been chipping away at democratic institutions over the years. He has turned Turkey from a parliamentary democracy to a presidential one. He's concentrated the power of the presidential office. Overall, Erdogan has done much to erode Turkey's republican credentials. The opposition had vowed to undo this damage, but Turkish voters still narrowly rejected them. Erdogan won with 52% of the vote in this runoff election. His opponent, Kemal Kilicdaroglu, got about 48%. It was Erdogan's toughest ever election. He faced a coalition of opposition parties with Kilicdaroglu at their helm. The secular candidate vowed to fix Turkey. He pushed Erdogan to the wire, but Erdogan still prevailed. He delivered a diplomatic speech after his victory.
No one has lost today. All 85 million have won. As a requirement of the responsibility given to us by our nation, we are not offended, resentful, angry, or enraged with anyone. It is now time to put aside all the debates and conflicts regarding the election period and unite around our national goals and national dreams.
His opponent, Kilicdaroglu, has accepted the loss. However, he has vowed to keep fighting for democracy.
The will of the people to change the authoritarian rule is clear despite all the pressures. Now I have something to ask you, for yourselves, for your children, for the retirees, for our mothers and fathers, for our farmers and traders' brothers. Support the democracy struggle.
Erdogan has said he will not contest again, that he will give up power in 2028. Turkey has reposed faith in the tried and tested. But what will another 5 years of rule by the Turkish strongman mean for his country?
Closer to Turkey, tensions are growing between Iran and the Taliban. They are trading gunfire. Over the weekend, lethal clashes broke out at the border. At least 3 people have died, 2 Iranian border guards and 1 Taliban fighter. Threats are being issued by both sides. The situation is being described as dangerous by some observers. But what triggered the tensions in the first place? Well, this dispute is about water. specifically the Helmand River. It is the longest river of Afghanistan, stretching more than 2,000 miles. Both Iran and Afghanistan depend on the Helmand. It originates in the high mountains of the Hindu Kush and feeds into the wetlands of Iran. In recent weeks, the river has sparked tensions. Iran says it is not getting access to Helmand's waters. It accuses the Taliban of throttling the river's flow. The Taliban denies the charge, but over the weekend, the dispute took an ugly turn. There was shooting at Nimroz, at a border checkpoint. Nimroz is a border province of Afghanistan. We don't know exactly what happened. Both sides accuse the other of opening fire. After the clashes, Iran is said to have closed an important border crossing, the Milak-Zaranj post. This is a commercial crossing. It is away from the area where the clashes happened. It is believed Iran closed this post in response to the firing. So it is clear, all is not well between Iran and Afghanistan. This is not the first time this has happened. The dispute is over Helmand's waters. This is an old one. Its origins can be traced back to the 1940s and 50s. During those years, Afghanistan built two major dams along the Helmand. This had alarmed the Iranians because the country had experienced intense droughts. In 1973, a water-sharing treaty was signed, but the dispute was never resolved. Iran says the treaty is not being honored. In recent weeks, Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi has issued repeated warnings. I have the statements with me. Listen to this. This is Raisi talking about the water dispute with the Taliban, and I quote, "We will not allow the rights of our people to be violated. I warn the rulers of Afghanistan to immediately give the people their water rights. Take my words seriously now or don't complain later."
I warn the rulers of Afghanistan to immediately give the people of Sistan Baluchistan their water rights. The Afghan side should allow our experts to go for evaluation straight away. If our experts confirm the lack of water, we have nothing else to say. Otherwise, we will not allow the rights of our people to be violated.
So what was the Taliban's response? Well, Kabul hasn't taken the criticism kindly. They have issued their own threats. Again, I have some statements. This is from the Taliban's defense ministry. Making excuses for war and negative actions is not in the interest of any of the parties. Kabul rejects the charge that it hasn't honored the treaty, so neither side is mincing their words. And this dispute could worsen bilateral ties. In recent months, both sides have made progress. In February, Iran took a major decision. It handed over the Afghan embassy in Tehran to the Taliban. Iran also accepted Taliban-appointed diplomats. It wasn't a formal recognition of the Taliban regime, but the move brought the two sides closer. The water wars could reverse this progress. Reports say both sides have held talks. Attempts are being made to diffuse tensions. Remains to be seen if diplomacy can solve this. New Delhi will be watching very closely. India depends on Iran for its engagements with Afghanistan. This year, India shipped humanitarian assistance to Afghans. Wheat consignments were delivered via the Chabahar port. Last year, India had sent a technical team to Kabul to coordinate the delivery of humanitarian assistance. So India will be monitoring the situation at the borders. This is a developing story, and we'll keep a track of the latest developments. Speaking of debt, China has its own share of trouble as well. Local governments in China are drowning in debt. They are in a pretty bad place. Just how bad? Let me tell you. The city of Wuhan has decided to name and shame borrowers. They have printed a list of 259 entities in the state newspaper. How much money do they owe? Around 300 million yuan, which is around $42 million. Some of these loans date back to December 2018. And who are these borrowers? A range of businesses, car companies, financial bureaus, real estate firms, all of them owe money to the Wuhan government. This is the first time the city has resorted to such a strategy. The desperation is almost childlike. Think back to your school days. Remember when talkative students had their names written on the blackboard? This is very similar. So the question is, what's happening in Wuhan? Is the city running out of cash? Wuhan's revenue in the first quarter of this year was $7 billion. On paper, that's a lot. But compare it to last year. The revenue is 8.5% less compared to quarter one of 2022. So liquidity crunch could be one reason. You need money to pay your own debt. The Wuhan government has asked these 250 plus entities to repay the loans immediately. But here's the problem. Wuhan is just a small part of a much bigger issue. Like I said, China's local governments are drowning in debt. How much money are we talking about? According to Goldman Sachs, $23 trillion. That's how big the debt pile is. Let me put that number in perspective. China's entire GDP is around $12 trillion. So the total government debt is twice the national GDP. This raises two questions. Number one, why were so many loans taken? And number two, will there be a crisis down the line? Most of these loans were taken in the last 2 decades. That's when China began a building spree. Ports, highways, high-rises, China was building at the rate of knots. That infrastructure push was backed by loans. But will it backfire? That's where experts are divided. You see, most of this debt is owned by state banks. So the central government in Beijing has a lot of power over it. They can just ask the banks to roll over the payments or maybe extend the deadline. But for how long? Eventually, these local governments will have to repay, and that's where revenue is a problem. Local government debt was 120% of revenue in 2022. In some cities, it's even worse, like Hegang in northeastern China. By 2021, their total debt had risen to 30 billion yuan. That's 230% of their income. Think of it this way. You have taken a lot of loans from your brother. Your debt is now more than your income. The good news is the lender is family. Maybe he will extend the deadline. The bad news is you will have to pay eventually. For local governments, that means tightening the screws, smaller budgets, more taxes, and lesser expenses. Also, more ways of raising funds, which brings us back to Wuhan. The local government's move shows how desperate they are for cash. Any money is good money right now. And with that, it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. Starting with Chile, thousands of people gathered in Santiago to break a Guinness World Record. People formed the largest human image of a bicycle. In the US, Olympic champion Carissa Moore won women's title at Surf Ranch Pro, and SpaceX launched its latest Falcon 9 rocket on Saturday. And finally, what makes May 29th significant? Taking you back in history. On this day in 1953, for the first time, 2 explorers reached the top of the world's highest mountain, the Everest. Edmund Hillary was a beekeeper from New Zealand, and Tenzing Norgay was a skilled climber from Nepal. Mount Everest Day marks their remarkable accomplishment. We leave you with that. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Welcomed and congratulated by their fellow members of the expedition. Poor Tenzing descended from his glory into the center of a minor political storm. He was born in Nepal and grew up in India, and both nations are now at loggerheads to claim him as their national. However, Tenzing was unruffled when Colonel Hunt congratulated him and Hillary. 2 unassuming men had climbed the 29,000-foot monarch of the Himalayas.
Vamos a repetir el pase del juego. Se apuren los patinadores, subieron del graduamos el día de hoy para ingresar a...
Moving through the clouds there, Falcon 9 has successfully lifted off. There's that gorgeous view on your screen there of the...